Hi friends, Pastor Terry here. We are Okotoks Alliance Church, and this is the 10-Minute Coach. We're in John chapter 4, the end of John chapter 4, and going into chapter 5. Now in doing that, we're crossing kind of a natural punctuation mark in John's text. When you get to chapter 5, it says sometime later. That is marking what's called an inclusio. It's following what's called an inclusio. The opening bookmark of that inclusio is the wedding at Cana. The closing bookend to that inclusio is the end of chapter 4, where Jesus is back in Cana again. And so it kind of forms a natural section of what took place there. And in the message on Sunday, I recapped some of the threads that are there. I've used the metaphor of a Turkish carpet and how the threads are woven together. And you see these threads coming. We're going to use that metaphor for a couple of more weeks because those threads continue to be particularly significant. But one of those threads is the wedding at Cana, the idea of wedding, the idea of wine. Those are all threads that are present and are going to continue to be present through much of the gospel. But the thing that connects these two sections together are two healing stories. The healing of the official's son, the end of chapter 4. And this is probably a non-Jewish guy who is coming. He's probably of the royal house, like an official in the royal house of Herod Antipas. He was one of the sons of Herod the Great, who, sent the soldiers after the baby boys in Bethlehem. He was Herod the Great. They call him the Great because of all the building that he did around Israel during his reign. But he was also a horrific man. He was a tyrant, bloodthirsty, eventually lost his sanity, murdered his wife, murdered children. Like, the guy's just bonkers. So this is his son. Yay. Anyway, that's a little bit of the backstory to the Herods. But this guy comes looking for Jesus to heal his son, and as I'd encourage you to look up the sermon. There's this transition that takes place where he goes from being a certain royal official, that's in chapter 4, verse 36, to becoming a father. That's how John describes him. And I believe we're supposed to mark that transition in who he is, who he perceives himself to be, how the text understands him to be. And then we cross over into chapter 5, and we have this introduction to a setting in Jerusalem. Jesus has gone back to Jerusalem, and we have this setting at the pool of Bethesda, and this invalid who's been ill for 38 years. So just to make sure that you catch the point, verse 43 to 45, whose land, whose authority, that was point one from that message. In verse 44, it says, Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. The Greek word for country there has the idea of fatherland attached to it, his own, which is a really unhelpful word for us post Second World War. But it has this idea of ownership attached to it, his own country. Well, we're referring to Galilee, and it says a prophet is without honor, and yet the people come. And one of the points that we talk about is the fact that they come looking for the signs and wonders. Verse 48, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe, said Jesus. But this royal official does believe. So he becomes the exception to the norm. We go into chapter 5, and Jesus has gone back to Jerusalem, and we again have sort of this idea of whose land is this, whose country is it. And this is where Jesus does something that is really telling. He does what God alone can do. There are times in the scriptures when you see Jesus doing man stuff, and there are times when you see him doing God stuff. And it's very telling, and it's where we get this understanding that the incarnation is Jesus as fully man and fully God. And there are times when we see him exercising one versus the other. Jesus wept. That's a very human thing to do. Jesus said, pick up your mat and walk on the Sabbath. He's setting aside Sabbath rules. Only God can do this. And so it doesn't say it in exactly those words, but this is what John is inviting us to note. The second point of the message, whose word are you believing? The man just believed the word of Jesus, and that was kind of what was reckoned to him as faith, and went home. It says in the end of chapter 50, "Go," Jesus replied, "your son will live." The man took Jesus at his word, or he believed the word more literally, and departed, and the healing took place, and he and his family believe. And then the fourth point, which royal will you follow? Well, that's just an attempt to sort of say this man no longer is being referred to by his royal title. He is a father, and this is how Jesus has encountered him. Get into chapter 5, and I've offered you a few questions in the back of the sermon notes just to let you dig a little bit deeper. And one of those is to kind of connect a thread within the Gospel of John by going back and looking at a couple of different passages of Scripture. The bookend that I just mentioned, John chapter 2, compared to John chapter 4, verse 46, where Jesus is in Cana. But here's one that's kind of interesting. When John uses numbers and something specific, it's worth paying attention. It says in verse 2, Bethsaida, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. 5 colonnades. Is that just an interesting little bit of data, or is he alluding to something more significant there? And I would suggest he's alluding to several things, because just in our reading, we just met a woman in the previous chapter who had 5 husbands. The man she was with now was not her husband, and in front of her stood Jesus, the perfect husband, the groom who has come to claim his bride. Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? What about the 5 books of Torah? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The 5 books of Torah, the law. We're going to find multiple times that there's going to be a conversation going on about what the law can accomplish and what it cannot accomplish. We just read on a little bit further to verse 5. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. That's a very specific number. What is up with that? And if this is where we kind of go back to paying attention to our Sunday school lessons when we were kids, maybe the number 38 is vaguely familiar, is it? Where does that show up? And I've given it to you in the notes. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 14. The wilderness wanderings are said there to have been 38 years. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Is it possible that there is some connection here? We don't want to lean too much on these things, but there's this sense in which, and I said this on Sunday, the people who weren't supposed to listen do. The woman at the well and the entire Samaritan village. This royal official from Herod Antipas's household and his entire family, they listen, they respond to Jesus. And then Nicodemus, jury's still out on him, should have been listening. A Pharisee, ruling house, wealthy man, highly regarded teacher in Israel. At the healing pool, a Jewish man who's been crippled for 38 years. And you get to the end of that text, and you tell me, has he believed? Does he follow Jesus? We don't know. There's a practice of reading Scripture, which is to read it, reflect on it, pray about it, read it again, reflect on it, pray about it, read it again, and maybe jot down the questions that you have as you're reading through. One of the frustrating things for us is that the Scriptures don't always answer the questions we have. And we have to be honest about that. If we try to fill in the blanks and say, well, maybe this, what about that, perhaps, we must declare that we hold those opinions tentatively, cautiously. Maybe this, could be that. When I read, and normally I read 2 or 3 commentaries in preparation for preaching, I'm comparing what the different scholars have to say, people who are far more learned, much smarter than me, deep knowledge in the original languages, yada, yada, yada. They've read a bunch of commentaries themselves, bring some kind of summary. I always respect when they say could be this, could be that. Here's why I think it's probably this, and leave the door open. Usually it's around things like, did the man who'd been crippled for 38 years believe? Well, we don't know. We can't decide that. The scriptures don't tell us, so apparently we don't have to know. And we can make maybe some educated guesses around it. Part of the reason I wanted to introduce the beginning of chapter 5 this week is because the next part of chapter 5 is pretty intense, and I wanted a leg up for next Sunday, so I wasn't having to deal with the entire chapter, or at least you had a bit of an introduction to it. That's as much time as I have for now, but let me invite you to take your questions to Scripture, think, pray, reflect, and ultimately take them to Jesus, because he is the one that confronts us. My last question in the sermon notes: what man stands before you? Drawing a connection between the man that stood before the woman at the well and the man who stands before this man who'd been crippled for 38 years. And we must decide what we're going to do with him. He is the one who helps this man who said, I have no man to help me. Then a man stood in front of him. I'm Pastor Terry Lee. We are Okotoks Alliance Church. This has been the 11-Minute Coach. Bless you, and bye for now.